Elena Martinez had always been different from the other girls in her small Texas border town. While they spent their afternoons gossiping about boys and planning weekend parties, she buried herself in military history books and practiced combat drills in her backyard. Her father, a retired Marine sergeant, had raised her to be tough after her mother died when Elena was just 8 years old. At 19, Elena stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, but her determination was gigantic. She had enlisted in the army against her father's wishes, who believed the military was no place for his little girl. But Elena wasn't just any girl. She possessed an unusual gift that she kept hidden from everyone around her. She could sense danger before it happened, almost like a sixth sense that had saved her life more times than she could count. The morning of her deployment to Afghanistan, Elena stared at herself in the bathroom mirror of the military base. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her brown eyes reflected both excitement and nervousness. She touched the small silver cross her mother had given her, now hanging around her neck, and whispered a prayer for protection. Her unit, the 25th Infantry Division, was scheduled to leave for Kandahar province within hours. Elena had trained harder than most of her male counterparts, earning respect through sheer determination and skill. She could outshoot many of them, and had proven herself during countless training exercises, yet she still felt the weight of proving herself overseas. During the pre-deployment briefing, Colonel Harrison addressed the gathered soldiers. His weathered face spoke of decades of service, and his voice commanded absolute attention. Elena sat in the third row, taking detailed notes as he outlined their mission objectives. They would be working alongside Afghan forces to secure several villages that had been under Taliban control. "Remember," Colonel Harrison said, his eyes scanning the room, "we're not just representing ourselves out there. We're representing our country, our families, and each other. Trust your training. Trust your instincts, and most importantly, trust each other." After the briefing, Elena's squad gathered in the mess hall for what might be their last American meal for months. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, her squad leader, was a tough but fair man from California who had served 2 previous tours. He had initially been skeptical about having a woman in his unit, but Elena had quickly proven her worth during training. "Martinez," he called out as she sat down with her tray. "You ready for this?" Elena nodded firmly. "More than ready, Sergeant. I've been preparing for this my whole life." The other members of her squad, Private Johnson from Alabama, Corporal Stevens from New York, and Private First Class Thompson from Oregon, had gradually accepted her presence. Johnson, who was only 18 and looked even younger, seemed grateful to have someone else who appeared less intimidating than the older soldiers. As they ate, the conversation turned to home and what they were leaving behind. Johnson talked about his girlfriend and how he planned to propose when he returned. Stevens mentioned his 2 young children and how much he would miss their soccer games. Thompson, ever the joker, made everyone laugh by doing impressions of their drill instructor. Elena listened quietly, occasionally contributing to the conversation but mostly observing. She had learned early in her military career that sometimes it was better to listen than to speak. Her father had taught her that wisdom came from watching and understanding people's true nature. Later that evening, as she packed her final belongings, Elena's roommate Sarah Chen stopped by to say goodbye. Sarah was staying stateside for another assignment, and the two had become close friends during their time together. "I'm going to miss having someone to complain about the food with," Sarah said, trying to keep the mood light despite the tears in her eyes. Elena smiled and hugged her friend. "Keep an eye on things here. When I get back, I want to hear all about what I missed." "Promise me you'll be careful," Sarah said seriously. "I know you're tough, but promise me you won't take any unnecessary risks." Elena nodded solemnly. "I promise. I'm coming back home." That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bunk staring at the ceiling and thinking about the unknown challenges ahead. She had trained for combat, studied enemy tactics, and prepared mentally for the realities of war. But no amount of training could fully prepare someone for what they might face in an active combat zone. She thought about her father and how proud he would be, despite his initial concerns. She thought about her mother and wondered if she was watching over her from heaven. Most of all, she thought about the strange mark that had appeared on her left shoulder blade 3 days ago. A dark, talon-like shape that seemed to have burned itself into her skin overnight. Elena had hidden the mark from everyone, including the medical staff during her final physical examination. She wasn't sure what it meant, but something deep inside told her it was connected to her unusual intuitive abilities. The mark didn't hurt, but it seemed to tingle whenever danger was near, almost like an early warning system. As dawn approached, Elena finally drifted off to sleep, dreaming of her mother's gentle voice telling her she was destined for something greater than she could imagine. In her dream, her mother pointed to the sky and said, "The eagles will guide you, Misha. Trust in what you cannot see." The next morning came quickly. Elena woke before her alarm, feeling refreshed despite the few hours of sleep. She dressed in her combat uniform, checked her gear one final time, and headed to the staging area where her unit was gathering for departure. The atmosphere was tense, but determined. Families had come to see their loved ones off, and there were tears, hugs, and final words of encouragement. Elena's father had driven through the night from Texas to be there. When she saw him standing near the fence, she felt her heart skip a beat. "I'm proud of you, Mija," he said, using his pet name for her as they embraced. "Your mother would be proud too. Come home safe." "I will, Papa. I promise." As the buses loaded to take them to the airfield, Elena took one last look at the base that had been her home for the past year. She was leaving as a soldier, but something told her she would return as something entirely different. The mark on her shoulder blade tingled gently, as if responding to her thoughts, and Elena wondered what destiny awaited her in the mountains of Afghanistan. The flight to Afghanistan took nearly 20 hours with refueling stops, giving Elena plenty of time to think and observe her fellow soldiers. Some slept, others played cards, and a few wrote letters home. Elena spent most of the journey studying maps of their deployment area and reviewing intelligence reports about recent Taliban activity in the region. Kandahar province was known for its harsh terrain and even harsher enemies. The mountains provided perfect hiding spots for insurgents, and the local population was often caught between loyalty to the government and fear of Taliban retaliation. Elena's unit would be stationed at Forward Operating Base Chapman, a relatively small outpost that served as a hub for operations in the surrounding valleys. When they finally landed at Kandahar Airfield, the heat hit Elena like a physical blow. Even in the early morning hours, the temperature was already climbing toward what would be a scorching day. The landscape was unlike anything she had ever seen. Endless stretches of brown earth, rocky hills, and a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Sergeant Rodriguez gathered the squad near their equipment pile. "Welcome to paradise," he said with his typical dry humor. "Remember what they taught us in training. Trust no one except your battle buddies, keep your weapons clean, and stay alert at all times." The convoy ride to FOB Chapman took 3 hours through some of the most dangerous roads in Afghanistan. Elena sat in the back of an armored vehicle, her rifle ready, scanning the landscape for any signs of trouble. The mark on her shoulder blade had been tingling since they landed, keeping her on high alert. Halfway to their destination, the convoy stopped suddenly. Elena heard voices shouting outside and felt her heart rate increase. Through the small window, she could see soldiers taking defensive positions around the vehicles. "What's happening?" Private Johnson whispered, his young face pale with anxiety. "Possible IED ahead," Corporal Stevens replied quietly. "Stay calm and be ready for anything." Elena closed her eyes and focused on the sensation from her mark. The tingling was getting stronger, but it felt different somehow. Not like immediate danger, but more like a warning of something significant about to happen. She had learned to trust these feelings over the years, even though she couldn't explain them to anyone else. After 30 minutes of tense waiting, the convoy began moving again. An explosive ordnance disposal team had cleared what turned out to be a false alarm. Just metal debris that looked suspicious on their scanning equipment. But Elena's mark continued to tingle, telling her that real danger was still out there somewhere. FOB Chapman was smaller than Elena had expected, surrounded by concrete walls topped with razor wire. Guard towers stood at each corner, manned by soldiers who watched the surrounding hills with careful attention. The base contained sleeping quarters, a mess hall, communications center, medical facility, and various other support buildings. Elena was assigned to a shared room with 3 other female soldiers, 2 medics, and a communications specialist. Her bunk was narrow and hard, but after the long journey she was grateful for any place to rest. She stored her gear in the metal locker beside her bed and tried to make the small space feel somewhat like home. Over the next several days, Elena settled into the routine of deployment life. Morning formation at 0600, followed by breakfast, equipment checks, briefings, and various duties depending on the day's mission requirements. Her squad was assigned to patrol duties in the nearby villages, working to build relationships with local leaders and gather intelligence about insurgent activity. Elena quickly discovered that her intuitive abilities were even stronger in this environment. The mark on her shoulder seemed to react to threats before anyone else detected them. During her third patrol, she suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to tell her squad to take cover. Sergeant Rodriguez trusted her enough to order everyone down just seconds before sniper fire erupted from a distant hillside. "How did you know?" Rodriguez asked her later as they reviewed the incident. Elena shrugged, not wanting to reveal her secret. "Just a feeling, Sergeant." Something didn't seem right about the way the street was empty. Word of her lucky instincts began to spread around the base. Other soldiers started requesting her for their patrols, believing she was some kind of good luck charm. Elena didn't discourage these beliefs as they helped explain her accurate predictions without revealing the truth about her mysterious abilities. 3 weeks into their deployment, Elena's unit was assigned to accompany a group of Afghan army soldiers on a mission to investigate reports of weapons smuggling in a remote mountain village. The operation was scheduled to last 4 days and would require them to establish a temporary base camp in hostile territory. Captain Williams, the operation commander, briefed the combined American and Afghan forces in the base's main meeting room. Maps covered one wall showing the target area and planned routes. Elena studied the terrain carefully, noting the narrow valleys and steep mountainsides that could hide enemy fighters. "Intelligence suggests the weapons are being stored in caves above the village," Captain Williams explained. "Our Afghan partners will handle most of the interaction with locals, while we provide security and support." Elena noticed that the Afghan soldiers seemed nervous about something, speaking quietly among themselves in their local language. She wished she could understand what they were saying, but her Dari language skills were still limited. However, the mark on her shoulder was sending strong warning signals, more intense than she had experienced before. That evening, as Elena prepared her equipment for the mission, her roommate Lisa Martinez approached her. Lisa was a medic from California who had been in Afghanistan for 6 months already. "I heard you're going on the mountain operation," Lisa said with concern in her voice. "Be extra careful up there. I've treated soldiers who came back from that area, and they all said something felt wrong about the place." Elena nodded seriously. "What kind of wrong?" "They couldn't explain it. Just said they felt like they were being watched all the time, even when no one was around. Some of them reported hearing strange sounds at night, like large birds but bigger than any birds they'd ever heard." This information made Elena's mark tingle even more intensely. She had always been drawn to stories of unusual phenomena, and her mother used to tell her tales of protective spirits that watched over warriors in dangerous places. Elena wondered if there might be some truth to those old stories. The next morning, Elena's unit joined the convoy heading toward the mountains. As they climbed higher into the rocky terrain, she noticed that the landscape became increasingly wild and beautiful. Snow-capped peaks stretched into the distance and eagles soared on the thermals rising from the valleys below. Elena found herself watching the eagles with unusual interest. There seemed to be more of them than normal, and they appeared to be following the convoy's progress. When she mentioned this to Sergeant Rodriguez, he laughed and said she was becoming paranoid. But Elena's instincts told her otherwise. The mark on her shoulder was now pulsing regularly like a heartbeat, and she could feel something significant approaching. Whatever was waiting for them in those mountains, she sensed it would change everything about her understanding of the world and her place in it. As their convoy rounded a bend in the mountain road, Elena saw their destination for the first time, a small village nestled in a valley between towering cliffs. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and she could see people moving between the simple stone buildings. It looked peaceful enough, but Elena's enhanced senses detected danger lurking somewhere nearby. The eagles circling overhead seemed to cry out in warning, their calls echoing off the canyon walls like an ancient alarm system that only Elena seemed to understand. The village of Kale Jabbar sat like a forgotten jewel in the mountain valley, its ancient stone buildings telling stories of centuries past. Elena's unit established their temporary base camp on a ridge overlooking the settlement, giving them a strategic view of the surrounding area while maintaining a respectful distance from the local population. Elena was amazed by the village's beauty, despite the harsh environment. Children played in the dusty streets while women in colorful clothing moved between market stalls selling vegetables and handmade goods. Old men sat in the shade of grape arbors, smoking pipes and playing backgammon. It seemed almost impossible that weapons smugglers could be operating in such a peaceful setting. But Elena's mysterious mark continued to pulse with warning signals, especially when she looked toward the caves carved into the cliff faces above the village. Those caves had been used for storage and shelter for thousands of years, making them perfect hiding places for modern weapons caches. Captain Williams divided the forces into 3 teams for the search operation. Elena's squad would work with Afghan Lieutenant Nazir Ahmad and his men to investigate the lower caves, while other teams searched the village itself and the higher mountain passages. Elena was impressed by Lieutenant Ahmad's professionalism and his obvious respect for his own soldiers. "These mountains hold many secrets," Lieutenant Ahmad told Elena as they prepared to begin the search. "My grandfather used to say that spirits watch over this place, protecting it from those who would bring harm to innocent people." Elena felt her mark tingle at his words. "What kind of spirits?" Lieutenant Ahmad smiled mysteriously. "Eagle spirits, according to the old stories. They say warriors marked by the eagles are blessed with special protection and the ability to see truth where others see only shadows." Elena's hand instinctively moved toward her shoulder blade, where the Talon mark was hidden beneath her uniform. She wondered if Lieutenant Ahmad somehow knew about her secret, but his expression gave nothing away. The cave search began at dawn on their second day in the mountains. Elena's team climbed the narrow paths carved into the cliff face, their equipment heavy on their backs as they navigated the treacherous terrain. The caves were larger than Elena had expected, with multiple chambers extending deep into the mountainside. As they explored the first cave system, Elena noticed ancient paintings on the walls, images of hunters, animals, and what appeared to be large birds with outstretched wings. The paintings were thousands of years old, yet they seemed to glow with an inner light in the beam of her flashlight. "These are sacred images," one of the Afghan soldiers whispered to Lieutenant Ahmad in Dari. Elena's language skills were improving, and she caught enough of the conversation to understand they were discussing legends about the paintings. Deep in the third cave they searched, Elena's enhanced senses detected something that made her mark burn with intensity. Hidden behind a false wall of loose rocks, her team discovered exactly what they had been looking for: crates of weapons including assault rifles, ammunition, and explosives. But something else was hidden there too, something that made Elena's blood run cold. Among the weapons crates sat an ornate wooden box carved with symbols similar to those in the ancient cave paintings. The box seemed to pulse with energy that only Elena could feel, calling to her in a way she couldn't explain. When she touched the surface, images flashed through her mind. Visions of battles fought in these mountains centuries ago, of warriors marked with eagle talons, of an ancient war between light and darkness. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Elena called quietly. "You need to see this." Rodriguez approached the hidden cache and whistled low at the sight of so many weapons. "Good work, Martinez. This is exactly what intelligence said we'd find." But Elena was staring at the carved box, her mark now burning so intensely she could barely concentrate. "Sergeant, there's something else here. Something important." Before Rodriguez could respond, the sound of gunfire erupted from outside the cave. Elena's team immediately took defensive positions as radio chatter filled the air with urgent reports. The village was under attack by a large force of Taliban fighters, who had apparently been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. All units. Captain Williams's voice crackled over the radio. "We have multiple hostiles moving on the village from 3 directions. Estimate 40 to 50 fighters with heavy weapons. All teams return to base camp immediately for defensive positions." Elena's squad gathered the weapons evidence they could carry and began moving toward the cave entrance. But as they reached the mouth of the cave, Elena felt her mark pulse with the strongest warning yet. Without thinking, she tackled Lieutenant Ahmad to the ground, just as rocket-propelled grenade exploded against the cliff face where he had been standing. "How did you know?" Ahmad asked in amazement as rocks rained down around them. Elena helped him to his feet, her mind racing. "I saw movement on the ridge across the valley. Lucky guess." But it wasn't luck, and she was beginning to understand that her abilities were far more significant than she had ever imagined. The carved box back in the cave seemed to be calling to her, as if it held answers to questions she didn't even know how to ask. The firefight intensified as Elena's team made their way down the mountain path. Taliban fighters had positioned themselves strategically throughout the valley, turning what should have been a simple descent into a deadly gauntlet. Elena found herself predicting enemy movements before they happened, guiding her squad around ambush points and sniper positions with uncanny accuracy. "Martinez, how are you doing this?" Corporal Stevens asked during a brief lull in the fighting. "It's like you can see through walls or something." Elena just shook her head, focusing on getting her team safely back to base camp. But privately, she was beginning to wonder if her abilities were connected to this place, these mountains, and the ancient legends Lieutenant Ahmad had mentioned. As they reached the base camp perimeter, Elena saw that the situation was more serious than she had initially understood. The Taliban force was larger and better equipped than intelligence had suggested, and they seemed to know exactly where the American and Afghan forces were positioned. It was almost as if someone had given them detailed information about the operation. During a strategic meeting that evening, Captain Williams reviewed their options. The enemy had them surrounded. Communications with headquarters were intermittent due to the mountain terrain, and their ammunition supplies were limited for an extended siege. "We need to break out of here before they bring up heavy artillery," Captain Williams decided. "But we'll need someone who can scout ahead and find us a safe route through their positions." Elena felt all eyes turn toward her. Word of her lucky instincts had spread throughout the unit, and everyone knew she had kept her squad alive during the cave search and subsequent fighting. "Martinez," Captain Williams said, "I know this is asking a lot, but we need someone who can move through enemy territory and find us a way out. Are you willing to try?" Elena nodded without hesitation, even though her mark was warning her that the most dangerous part of this mission was still to come. "Yes, sir. When do we start?" As night fell over the mountain valley, Elena prepared for the most important reconnaissance mission of her life. She had no way of knowing that the ancient spirits Lieutenant Ahmad had mentioned were already beginning to take notice of the young warrior who carried their mark, or that her actions in the next few hours would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone trapped in those mountains. The carved box back in the cave seemed to pulse with energy even at this distance, as if ancient powers were awakening after centuries of sleep, drawn by the presence of someone finally worthy of their attention. Elena moved through the darkness like a shadow, her enhanced senses guiding her around enemy positions with an accuracy that seemed impossible even to her. The mark on her shoulder blade had stopped tingling and now felt warm, almost comforting, as if something was actively helping her navigate the dangerous terrain. The mountain night was alive with sounds that most people would never notice. The whisper of wind through rock crevices, the distant call of night birds, the soft padding of wild animals moving through the underbrush. But Elena heard something else, something that made her pause behind a large boulder and listen more carefully. High above her head, she could hear the distinctive cry of eagles, even though eagles were not known to fly at night. The call seemed to be coming from multiple directions, creating a pattern that felt almost like communication. Elena found herself understanding the meaning behind the sounds. Warnings about enemy positions, suggestions for safe routes, guidance toward her objective. Following the eagle's guidance, Elena discovered that the Taliban forces were more spread out than Captain Williams had realized. They had positioned fighters throughout the valley in small groups rather than concentrating their forces, making it possible to find gaps in their coverage. More importantly, she detected something that changed everything about their situation. Hidden in a narrow canyon about 2 miles from their base camp, Elena found the Taliban's main supply depot and command center. Dozens of fighters were resting there, believing themselves safe from detection. Their leader, a man with distinctive scars across his face, was studying American military maps and speaking on a satellite phone in fluent English. Elena crept closer, using skills she had never been taught but somehow knew, moving with a silence that seemed supernatural. Her mark was now glowing with a soft warmth that helped her see clearly in the darkness, allowing her to observe details that would have been invisible to normal vision. What she overheard chilled her to the bone. The Taliban leader was receiving real-time intelligence about American troop movements from someone inside their own forces. Worse, he was planning a massive assault on the base camp at dawn, using information about weak points in their defensive positions that only someone with access to their operational plans could have known. Elena realized that her reconnaissance mission had just become something far more critical. She needed to get back and warn Captain Williams about the traitor in their midst, but she also saw an opportunity to turn the tables on their enemies. The Taliban supply depot was poorly guarded, with most of the fighters sleeping and only a few sentries posted. Elena's enhanced abilities told her exactly where each guard was positioned and when they would be looking in other directions. More importantly, she could see that their ammunition and fuel supplies were stored carelessly close together. Moving like a ghost, Elena worked her way toward the supply area. She had brought demolition charges for a different purpose, but now she saw a chance to eliminate the enemy's advantage in one decisive action. As she prepared the explosives, she felt guidance from sources she couldn't explain, knowledge of exactly where to place charges for maximum effect, timing sequences that would prevent the enemy from saving their equipment. But as Elena was setting the final charge, one of the sentries turned in her direction unexpectedly. Time seemed to slow down as their eyes met across 30 yards of rocky ground. The guard opened his mouth to shout an alarm, his rifle swinging toward her position. Elena's mark suddenly blazed with energy, and something extraordinary happened. High above them, an enormous shadow blocked out the stars. The guard looked up in terror as what appeared to be a massive eagle, far larger than any natural bird, dove toward him with talons extended. The creature struck with such force that the guard was knocked unconscious without making a sound. Elena stared in amazement as the giant eagle landed beside her, its golden eyes meeting hers with obvious intelligence. The bird's feathers seemed to glow with the same energy she felt from her mark, and she realized that this was no ordinary creature. This was one of the eagle spirits Lieutenant Ahmad had told her about, and it was here to help her. The eagle gestured with its head toward the sleeping camp, and Elena understood. She had only minutes before the explosives would detonate, and she needed to be far away from the blast zone. Following the eagle's lead, Elena ran toward a ridge that would provide cover from the explosion. When the charges went off, the night sky lit up like daylight. Secondary explosions from ammunition and fuel supplies continued for nearly 10 minutes, destroying the Taliban's entire logistical base and eliminating their numerical advantage. Elena watched the fireworks from her safe position, the giant eagle perched beside her like a supernatural guardian. But her work wasn't finished. Elena still needed to identify the traitor who had been feeding information to the enemy. As she made her way back toward base camp, her mark provided insights that felt like puzzle pieces falling into place. She remembered conversations, noticed patterns in who had access to what information, and began to understand who was betraying them. Elena reached base camp just as Captain Williams was preparing to wake everyone for an emergency briefing about the explosions they had all seen and heard. She requested an immediate private meeting with him, knowing that what she had to reveal would shock everyone. "Sir," Elena began carefully, "I have intelligence about enemy positions and their planned assault, but I also have reason to believe we have a security breach in our own forces." Captain Williams listened intently as Elena described what she had observed at the Taliban command post, though she carefully omitted details about the giant eagle and her supernatural guidance. When she mentioned the traitor's communications, Williams' face grew grave. "Do you know who it is?" he asked. Elena nodded reluctantly. "Yes, sir. Based on the information they had and the timing of their communications, it has to be someone with access to our operational planning and real-time position updates." She explained her reasoning, pointing out that only 3 people had complete access to the information the Taliban leader had been discussing. One was Captain Williams himself, which was obviously impossible. The second was Master Sergeant Collins, a veteran with 20 years of service and an impeccable record. The third was Lieutenant Bradley Marcus, a relatively new officer who had joined their unit just before deployment. Elena's enhanced senses had detected something wrong about Marcus from the beginning, but she hadn't been able to identify what bothered her about him until now. "Marcus has been asking a lot of questions about our patrol schedules and defensive positions," Elena continued, questions that seemed normal at the time, but now appear suspicious in light of how much the enemy knew about our operations. Captain Williams was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "This is a very serious accusation, Martinez. Do you have any proof besides your observations at the enemy camp?" Elena had been thinking about this during her return journey. Sir, I suggest we feed different information to each of the 3 people with access, then see which version shows up in enemy hands. It's a classic counterintelligence technique. Williams nodded approvingly. Good thinking. We'll implement that plan immediately. In the meantime, I want you to keep this information completely confidential until we can verify your suspicions. As Elena left the captain's tent, she felt the mark on her shoulder pulse with satisfaction, as if the ancient powers that had chosen her were pleased with her actions. She was beginning to understand that her role in this conflict was far more significant than just being another soldier following orders. The giant eagle she had seen was perched on a rock outcropping near the camp perimeter, watching over them like a supernatural sentinel. When Elena looked in its direction, the creature spread its massive wings in what seemed like a salute, before disappearing into the darkness. Elena realized that tomorrow would bring the final confrontation with their enemies, and that her mysterious abilities would be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time since arriving in Afghanistan, she felt truly confident in her mission and her purpose. Dawn broke over the mountains with an orange glow that seemed to set the peaks on fire. Elena had barely slept, spending most of the night on watch duty and thinking about the events of the past few days. Her mark had been constantly warm since her encounter with the giant eagle, filling her with energy and awareness that felt both foreign and completely natural. Captain Williams implemented Elena's counterintelligence plan at the morning briefing. He gave 3 different versions of their planned response to the Taliban attack, one to Master Sergeant Collins, one to Lieutenant Marcus, and kept the 3rd version, known only to himself and Elena. Each version included different timing and troop positions that would reveal which information made its way to the enemy. Elena watched Lieutenant Marcus carefully during the briefing. Her enhanced senses picked up subtle signs of deception, micro-expressions, changes in breathing patterns, and an energy that felt wrong compared to the other soldiers. She was now certain that Marcus was their traitor, but she needed proof that would convince a military tribunal. As the units prepared for the expected Taliban assault, Elena positioned herself where she could observe the entire battlefield, while also keeping an eye on Marcus. Her mark was pulsing steadily, warning her that the main confrontation was approaching rapidly. The first enemy probes began around noon, small groups of fighters testing their defensive positions from multiple directions. Elena noticed immediately that the Taliban forces were responding to intelligence from the version of the plan that had been given to Lieutenant Marcus. They avoided the fake weak points that had been shared with Collins and focused their efforts exactly where Marcus had been told the defenses were strongest. Elena reported this observation to Captain Williams through their secure radio channel. "Sir, Pattern Charlie is confirmed. Recommend immediate action." Williams acknowledged her transmission and quietly ordered 2 military police soldiers to place Lieutenant Marcus under discreet surveillance. But before they could act, the situation escalated dramatically. A massive explosion rocked the base camp as Taliban artillery struck their communication center. In the chaos that followed, Elena saw Lieutenant Marcus slip away from his assigned position and move toward the perimeter. Her mark blazed with warning energy as she realized that Marcus was planning to escape and join his Taliban allies during the confusion of battle. Elena made a split-second decision that would define the rest of her military career. Instead of following proper channels and waiting for orders, she pursued Marcus on her own, guided by instincts that had never failed her. Marcus was moving through the rocky terrain with obvious familiarity, following a route that had clearly been planned in advance. Elena tracked him using skills that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her normal training, moving silently over ground that should have made stealth impossible. When Marcus reached a predetermined meeting point, Elena watched from concealment as he embraced a Taliban commander who was obviously expecting him. They spoke in low voices, Marcus pointing back toward the base camp and providing detailed information about defensive positions and American casualties. Elena knew she had to act immediately. The information Marcus was sharing would allow the Taliban to overrun their defensive positions within hours, but she was one soldier against multiple enemies. With no backup and no way to call for support, that's when the eagles returned. Elena looked up to see not just one giant eagle, but an entire flight of the massive birds circling overhead. As she watched in amazement, the eagles began diving toward the Taliban fighters with Marcus, their enormous talons and beaks proving devastatingly effective weapons. In the confusion created by the eagle attack, Elena moved to apprehend Marcus. But the traitorous officer saw her coming and drew his sidearm, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "I should have killed you days ago," Marcus snarled. "I knew you were trouble the moment you started showing off with your lucky instincts." Elena faced him calmly, her mark now blazing with such intensity that she could feel its power flowing through her entire body. "Why, Marcus? Why betray your own people?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "Money, Martinez. More money than you could imagine. The Taliban pays very well for American military intelligence, and I've got gambling debts that would destroy my career anyway." Elena felt sick at his casual admission of betrayal. Around them, the giant eagles were finishing their work with the Taliban fighters, but her attention was focused entirely on the man who had endangered all their lives for personal profit. "It's over, Marcus. Surrender now and maybe the court-martial will show mercy." Instead, Marcus raised his weapon toward Elena. Time seemed to slow down as she saw his finger tighten on the trigger, but before he could fire, one of the giant eagles swooped down between them, its massive wings creating a whirlwind that knocked Marcus off balance. Elena moved with speed that surprised even her, disarming Marcus and subduing him with techniques she had never been taught, but somehow knew perfectly. As she secured his hands with zip-tie restraints, she felt the mark on her shoulder blade pulse with satisfaction. The giant eagle that had intervened landed nearby, fixing Elena with its golden eyes. For a moment, she felt a connection to something ancient and powerful, as if she was part of a tradition that stretched back thousands of years. The eagle's gaze seemed to communicate approval and recognition, acknowledging her as a true guardian of these mountains. Elena secured Lieutenant Marcus and began the difficult journey back to base camp, dragging her prisoner through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate safely. But the eagles continued to circle overhead, their presence somehow making the path clear and protecting her from any remaining Taliban forces in the area. When Elena finally reached the perimeter with Marcus in custody, the base camp was in chaos. The Taliban assault had been fierce, but without Marcus providing them real-time intelligence, the American and Afghan forces had successfully repelled the attack. Captain Williams was coordinating the final stages of the defensive operation when Elena approached with her prisoner. "Sir," Elena reported formally, "Lieutenant Marcus attempted to defect to enemy forces. I have evidence of his communications with Taliban commanders and his betrayal of operational intelligence." The entire command staff stared in shock as Elena presented Marcus to Captain Williams. The captured officer was disheveled and obviously terrified, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Word spread quickly through the base camp that the traitor had been identified and captured. Captain Williams immediately convened a field tribunal to document Marcus's crimes and Elena's heroic actions. As Elena gave her testimony, she carefully omitted any mention of the giant eagles or her supernatural abilities, focusing instead on observable facts about Marcus's suspicious behavior and his attempted defection. But other soldiers had witnessed the eagle attacks during the final battle, and stories were already spreading about the mysterious birds that had appeared to help the American forces. Elena realized that her secret might not remain hidden much longer, especially when Lieutenant Ahmad approached her after the tribunal. "The eagles have chosen you," Ahmad said quietly, his eyes filled with respect and wonder. "My grandfather's stories were true. The mountain spirits have marked you as one of their guardians." Elena looked at him carefully, trying to decide how much she could safely reveal. "I don't understand what you mean, Lieutenant." Ahmad smiled knowingly. "The mark on your shoulder, the one that burns with eagle fire. You carry the ancient sign of the mountain guardians. My people have legends about warriors like you, chosen to protect the innocent and fight against those who would bring darkness to sacred places." Elena felt her mark pulse at his words, as if responding to recognition from someone who understood its true meaning. She realized that Ahmad had known about her abilities all along, perhaps from the moment they first met. "What does it mean?" Elena asked softly. "What am I supposed to do?" "You are already doing it," Ahmad replied. "You saved all of us by exposing the traitor and stopping the enemy assault. But this is only the beginning. The Eagles have plans for you that extend far beyond this single battle." That evening, as Elena sat alone on the ridge overlooking the village, She felt the presence of the giant eagles even though she couldn't see them in the darkness. Her mark was warm and comfortable now, no longer warning of danger but instead filling her with a sense of purpose and belonging. She thought about her father back in Texas, who had always believed she was destined for something special. She thought about her mother's final words about eagles guiding her path. Most of all, she thought about the carved wooden box back in the cave, still calling to her with its ancient power. Elena realized that her deployment to Afghanistan had been more than just military service. She had been brought here for a specific purpose, chosen by forces beyond human understanding, to fulfill a role that connected her to the spiritual guardians of these mountains. As she prepared to return to her quarters, Elena made a decision that would change the course of her life. Tomorrow she would request permission to return to the cave and retrieve the carved box. She sensed that it contained answers to questions about her heritage and her destiny. That the mark on her shoulder blade pulsed gently, as if the ancient eagles were expressing their approval of her choice. Whatever secrets the box contained, Elena knew she was ready to learn the truth about who she really was and what she was meant to become. In the distance, she could hear the soft cry of eagles calling to each other in the darkness, their voices carrying promises of adventures and challenges that would test everything she thought she knew about herself and the world around her. 6 months later, Elena stood in the Pentagon briefing room, her dress uniform pristine and her posture perfect. The medal ceremony had concluded an hour ago, where she received the Silver Star for her actions in Afghanistan, but now came the moment she had been dreading, explaining the unexplainable to a room full of senior military officers. General Patricia Morrison, a stern woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, led the debriefing session. Elena had heard stories about the general's legendary attention to detail and her intolerance for anything that couldn't be documented with hard evidence. Around the conference table sat colonels, intelligence officers, and Pentagon analysts, all eager to understand how one young soldier had single-handedly identified a traitor and prevented a major tactical defeat. Sergeant Martinez, General Morrison began, consulting the thick file in front of her. Your actions in Afghanistan were exemplary by any standard. However, there are certain aspects of your reports that require clarification. Elena nodded respectfully. Yes, ma'am. I'm ready to answer any questions. Let's start with your reconnaissance abilities, Colonel Davidson from Army Intelligence interjected. Multiple witnesses report that you consistently predicted enemy positions and movements with impossible accuracy. How do you explain this? Elena had rehearsed this answer countless times during her journey home. Sir, I believe my success came from careful observation of environmental factors and patterns that others might have overlooked. Growing up hunting in Texas taught me to read landscapes and detect subtle signs of human presence. General Morrison studied Elena's face carefully. Sergeant, your commanding officer, Captain Williams, reports that you demonstrated what he called supernatural awareness of threats and opportunities. Those are not words a veteran officer uses lightly. Elena felt the mark on her shoulder blade tingle slightly, reminding her of its presence even though it had been months since she experienced its full power. The carved wooden box from the Afghan cave now sat locked in a secure storage facility, its secret still waiting to be explored under proper scientific conditions, ma'am. I understand how my performance might seem unusual, Elena replied carefully, but I believe it can be explained by a combination of training, intuition, and favorable circumstances. The room fell silent as the officers exchanged glances. Elena could sense their frustration with her non-specific answers, but she couldn't reveal the truth about her abilities without sounding delusional or compromising ongoing classified research into the artifacts recovered from the cave. Dr. Sarah Chen, a Pentagon researcher who had been quietly observing the session, finally spoke up. Sergeant Martinez, are you aware that similar reports of enhanced awareness and combat effectiveness have been documented throughout military history? Soldiers who seem to possess abilities beyond normal human capabilities? Elena looked at Dr. Chen with interest, sensing that this woman might understand more than the others. No, ma'am, I wasn't aware of that. There are classified files dating back to World War I describing soldiers who demonstrated what we might call paranormal abilities in combat situations. Dr. Chen continued. These individuals often reported physical sensations or markings that seemed to correlate with their enhanced performance. General Morrison shot Dr. Chen a warning look. But the researcher continued undeterred. What I'm saying, Sergeant, is that you're not the first person to experience what you've experienced. And you won't be the last. Elena felt her pulse quicken. For months, she had believed she was alone with her secret, that no one else would understand what had happened to her in those Afghan mountains. The possibility that others had shared similar experiences filled her with both relief and curiosity. Are you saying there are other soldiers like me? Elena asked cautiously. Dr. Chen nodded. There's a classified research program that studies soldiers who demonstrate unusual capabilities. If you're interested, and if you're willing to undergo extensive testing and evaluation, you might be a candidate for this program. General Morrison clearly wasn't happy with the direction the conversation was taking. Dr. Chen, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. Sergeant Martinez is here for a standard debriefing, not recruitment for experimental programs. But Elena was already intrigued. The mark on her shoulder had begun to pulse gently, as if responding to the mention of others like herself. General Morrison, ma'am, I would be very interested in learning more about this program Dr. Chen mentioned. The general studied Elena for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke with obvious reluctance. Sergeant, what Dr. Chen is referring to is highly classified and involves commitments that would fundamentally change your military career. Are you certain you want to pursue this path? Elena thought about her experiences in Afghanistan. The giant eagles, the ancient cave paintings, the mysterious wooden box that still called to her in her dreams. She thought about Lieutenant Ahmad's words about being chosen by mountain spirits, and her growing certainty that her abilities were connected to something much larger than herself. Yes, ma'am. Elena replied with conviction. I believe this is what I meant to do. General Morrison sighed and closed Elena's file. Very well. Dr. Chen will provide you with the necessary information and security clearances. But understand this, Sergeant. Once you enter this program, there's no going back to regular military service. You'll be part of something that officially doesn't exist. As the briefing concluded and the officers filed out of the room, Dr. Chen approached Elena with a warm smile. I think you're making the right choice, Elena. May I call you Elena? Yes, ma'am, of course. Good, and you can call me Sarah. We don't stand much on military formality in our program. Sarah pulled out a tablet and showed Elena a photograph that made her gasp in surprise. The image showed a cave wall, covered with paintings identical to those Elena had seen in Afghanistan. But according to the caption, this photograph had been taken in a mountain cave in Tibet, thousands of miles away from where Elena had served. These paintings appear in caves all over the world, Sarah explained. Always in mountainous regions, always depicting the same symbols and figures. We believe they mark sacred sites where individuals like yourself have been chosen for special purposes throughout history. Elena stared at the tablet, her mind racing with possibilities. How many others are there? People like me, I mean, currently active? About 24 worldwide. But we have evidence suggesting this phenomenon has been occurring for thousands of years. You're part of an ancient tradition, Elena, whether you realize it or not. As they walked through the Pentagon corridors toward Sarah's office, Elena felt a sense of destiny settling over her like a comfortable cloak. Her journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The eagles that had chosen her in Afghanistan were part of something global, something that connected her to guardians and protectors throughout history. Sarah, Elena said as they reached the elevator, the wooden box from the cave in Afghanistan. Do you know what's inside it? Sarah smiled mysteriously. That, Elena, is one of the first things we're going to find out together, but I suspect you already know more about its contents than you realize. As the elevator doors closed, Elena caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished metal. For just a moment, she could swear she saw the shadow of enormous wings spread behind her shoulders, and her mark pulsed with warmth that felt like welcome home. The room had burst into laughter during her medal ceremony, when she tried to explain her lucky instincts to the press. But General Morrison hadn't been laughing when she pointed to the mysterious mark that was now Elena's badge of honor and her entry into a world where the impossible was simply another day's work. Elena smiled as the elevator descended, knowing that her real adventures were just beginning.